Some endings feel definitive scenes that slam the door on a story with fire, noise, and a final breath of adrenaline. Audiences walk away assuming everything they saw was authorized, planned, and polished. But the truth hidden beneath those last frames is far stranger. A surprising number of action films reached their final moments not through studio planning, but through defiance endings captured quietly, secretly, and far outside the boundaries of official approval. Long after producers cleared the set and executives congratulated themselves on locking the script, certain directors refused to surrender their vision. With only a handful of trusted crew members, they returned to abandoned locations under the cover of night. Some set up makeshift lights. Some used whatever props were scattered around the set. Others dug into forgotten storage to find leftover pyrotechnics that had never been logged. These weren't sanctioned reshoots. These were covert missions fueled by instinct and rebellion. In these hidden shoots, actors performed stunts without insurance coverage. Cameras rolled without reports. Explosions were triggered by hand because there was no safety team left. No paperwork. No chain of command. Just raw filmmaking, the kind that survives only when no one in authority is watching. When the unapproved footage eventually reached editing rooms, it blended with the rest of the film like a secret stitched into familiar fabric. Some executives spotted the changes immediately and demanded answers. Others didn't realize what they were seeing until the film was nearly ready for release. And in more than one case, audiences reacted so strongly to these rogue endings that studios had no choice but to leave them intact, silently accepting scenes they had never agreed to shoot. Now, we peel back the curtain on 15 action movies whose endings were never meant to exist, final scenes captured illegally, shaped by risk, and preserved because they were simply too powerful to erase. Fact 1. The Last Boy Scout, 1991. The official production paperwork for The Last Boy Scout claimed the ending was finished, approved, and locked. The studio believed they had secured a tighter, more controlled finale. Nothing messy, nothing excessive. But director Tony Scott felt the sanitized version drained the film of its pulse. To him, the ending needed to reflect the brutal, chaotic world the characters lived in. And if the studio wasn't going to let him shoot it properly, he would simply shoot it himself. Late one night, long after the set had supposedly closed, Scott returned to the stadium location with Bruce Willis, a compact stunt team, and a camera operator willing to work off the books. There were no full lighting rigs, no studio trucks, and no schedule. They relied on leftover practical lights from earlier scenes, along with a few handheld units the crew strapped to improvised stands. Even the pyrotechnics were pulled from a stash meant for scenes already completed, charges that had never been logged or cleared. Scott choreographed a manic, frantic confrontation. Gunfire echoing through the empty stadium, explosions bursting behind Willis, and debris raining down as the camera moved in tight, unstable arcs. Several moments were improvised on the spot, shaped by instinct rather than notes. The stunt coordinator later admitted half the effects weren't tested there, simply wasn't time. When post-production began, the editor quietly inserted this unapproved footage into the cut, labeling it as alt material. Executives eventually noticed the difference, but by then, test audiences had already reacted to the energy Scott brought into those final moments. Reversing course meant costly reshoots, new approvals, and more delays, so the studio allowed the forbidden footage to remain. The unforgettable ending audiences saw on release day, the explosions, the chaos, the raw desperation, was never approved, never scheduled, and never supposed to exist. Fact 2. Deadly Prey, 1987. Deadly Prey is already famous for its guerrilla filmmaking style, but the truth behind its ending is even more unregulated than the rest of the production. The studio mandated a simple, quick finale, something cheap, clean, and easy to shoot. But director David A. Pryor didn't want easy. He wanted the film to close on a feral, unrestrained burst of violence that matched its tone. When the producers refused, Pryor acted without them. He gathered Ted Pryor, a few stuntmen, and a lone camera operator and slipped back into the forest clearing used earlier in the shoot. No call sheets, no studio oversight, no permits. The official props truck had already been returned, so the team created makeshift weapons using branches, old rubber blades, and anything they could salvage. Blood effects were mixed using leftover materials borrowed from a nearby horror set. What followed was a raw, improvised chase through thick brush. Actors sprinted barefoot on uneven terrain. Stunt performers collided with trees and rolled down slopes with almost no padding. The fight choreography was created moment by moment. With Ted Pryor performing moves the studio would have immediately shut down for safety reasons. One particularly dangerous tackle where both actors slam into a stump was captured in a single take because no one wanted to risk repeating it. When the footage reached the editing room, Pryor instructed the editor to integrate it before sending reels to the studio. By the time executives saw the rough cut, the guerrilla footage was already embedded deep in the structure of the climax. They were furious, but they also discovered that test viewers reacted strongly to the raw physicality of the secret finale. Replacing it would have cost money the production didn't have, and cutting it would have weakened the film's momentum. So the illegal ending stayed, and ultimately became one of the film's most iconic elements. Fact 3. Eye of the Tiger. 1986. The studio behind Eye of the Tiger pushed hard for an uplifting, straightforward ending, something that leaned into the heroic tone suggested by its famous soundtrack. But director Richard C. Sarafian believed the film's grit, revenge, and violence deserved a harsher final beat. When his request for a more intense climax was denied, he planned a covert shoot in plain sight. Sarafian contacted Gary Busey and a small stunt team and arranged to meet at an abandoned airstrip that production had already vacated. Nearly all equipment had been packed away, so they built their setup from scraps: older cameras, small battery lights, and a stunt truck modified with tools borrowed from a friend. The scene they shot involved a dangerous motorcycle versus truck confrontation choreographed entirely on the fly, with Busey performing more stunt riding than the studio would have allowed under any circumstances. Explosions were triggered using leftover pyrotechnics buried beneath scrap metal. With no safety team present, effects were detonated by hand, often only seconds before the camera rolled. Sparks flew in unpredictable arcs. Wind scattered smoke unexpectedly across the frame. Every obstacle made the footage feel more alive and more dangerous. Back in the editing room, Sarafian slipped the forbidden sequence into the assembly cut, matching it with the officially shot coverage. Executives reviewing the footage immediately noticed the discrepancy. This ending was far more aggressive, darker, and riskier than the one they had forced upon the director. Arguments erupted. But the energy of the guerrilla footage was undeniable. Internal viewings proved that the rogue ending played more powerfully than the studio-approved version. With distribution deadlines approaching, executives decided to keep it quietly. They never acknowledged it publicly, but the explosive finale that audiences saw was the result of a nighttime shoot that technically never existed. Fact 4. Avenging Force. 1986. The studio's vision for Avenging Force was a quick, polished finish: hero stands tall, villain falls, everything concludes neatly. But director Sam Furstenberg felt that such an ending betrayed the brutal, feral spirit of the film. To him, the world of political assassins and swamp-born violence deserved something dirtier, something that felt torn from the mud itself. When the producers refused to authorize a darker ending, Furstenberg acted on instinct. He quietly contacted Michael Dudikoff and a handful of stunt performers, gathering them on a patch of swamp terrain that had been struck from the schedule. The location was already being reclaimed by night fog when they arrived. With no lighting crew, they fastened flashlights to tree trunks and rigged a few flickering lamps scavenged from a nearby trailer. Wardrobe had been returned, so the cast wore damaged pieces left behind by mistake. Even the blade used for the fight was a substitute prop dug out of an old storage crate. The unsanctioned ending featured a vicious hand-to-hand struggle in knee-deep mud, where every movement felt heavy and claustrophobic. Dudikoff slipped multiple times during the shoot. One fall captured on camera became part of the final edit because it looked too real to reshoot. The stunt coordinator later revealed they shot the entire sequence in a single stretch to avoid drawing attention from nearby crew packing equipment for transport. When Furstenberg delivered the rough cut containing the secret ending, the studio erupted. They wanted it gone. But the bleak, suffocating tone resonated strongly with viewers during internal screenings, making the approved version feel weak by comparison. Pressed for time and unable to reshoot, the studio reluctantly accepted it. The closing moment that audiences remember: the mud, the struggle, the raw desperation came from a shoot the studio never sanctioned. Fact 5. Extreme Prejudice. 1987. For extreme prejudice, the studio insisted on a conventional hero's send-off. Nick Nolte walks away triumphant, justice served, fade out. Walter Hill, however, was never a filmmaker who softened his stories for comfort. He pushed for a grim, low-light standoff in a decaying industrial building, a moody, atmospheric finish that felt like a final bruise left on the audience. The studio vetoed it immediately. Hill moved forward anyway. Working with a loyal second-unit team, he scouted an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of El Paso. The windows were broken, the floors uneven, and the air thick with dust, precisely the aesthetic Hill wanted. The shoot took place after midnight. Only a few handheld lights, a battery-powered generator, and a small grip kit were used. The camera operator taped a flashlight to his shoulder to create moving shadows during the firefight. Nolte, dedicated and stubborn, insisted on performing most of his gunplay without a double. Some of the ricochet sparks were made using improvised metal rigs, because the official special effects department had already wrapped. The dramatic final fall of the antagonist, shot from a narrow catwalk, was staged with minimal safety setup, something the studio never would have approved. When Hill submitted the rough cut, executives immediately noticed the tonal shift. This wasn't the clean, polished ending they demanded. They argued fiercely, threatening to remove the sequence altogether. But internal test screenings revealed something unavoidable. Hill's guerrilla finale carried a weight the authorized ending lacked. With the release date approaching, the studio had no time to rebuild the conclusion. The illegal ending survived and became one of the film's defining moments. Fact 6. The Exterminator 21984. The production of The Exterminator 2 was turbulent from the start, with the studio constantly interfering, rewriting scenes, and pushing for a softer tone. By the time the film neared its conclusion, the official ending felt toothless, an anemic rooftop confrontation with little impact. Director Mark Buntsman knew it wouldn't satisfy fans of the original film, so he took a risk that could have shut the entire production down. He contacted Robert Ginty and a tiny sliver of the stunt team, gathering them at a deserted warehouse roof that had been slated for demolition. With most equipment already returned, they worked with what they had. A few borrowed lights, a fog machine provided by a friend in another crew, and an aging Arriflex camera that technically wasn't on the production's inventory sheet. The stunt coordinator brought small, unregistered pyro charges, dangerous, unpredictable, but effective. The guerrilla finale they filmed was far more intense than anything the studio approved. Ginty wielded a homemade flamethrower built from scrap metal. Sparks flew from metal beams as stunt performers slid across the gravel dangerously close to the roof's edge. The firelight warped shadows across the set, giving the sequence an unpolished, brutal aesthetic that suited the character far more than the studio's sanitized version. When the footage landed in the editing bay, Buntsman replaced the official ending without telling anyone. Executives discovered the swap only weeks before release and were enraged. But deadlines were immovable, and test viewers responded strongly to the raw, chaotic footage. The studio had no choice but to keep it. The fiery rooftop climax that audiences associate with The Exterminator 2 is a product of a nighttime shoot fueled by defiance, secrecy, and absolute disregard for studio boundaries. Fact 7. Strike Commando. 1987. The producers behind Strike Commando were desperate to wrap production. Money was nearly gone, and the studio wanted a quick, economical ending that avoided additional explosions or complicated stunt setups. But director Bruno Mattei was never someone who played by the rules. He believed the finale needed to erupt with chaos, something wild enough to fit Reb Brown's larger-than-life performance. If the studio wouldn't authorize it, he would capture it without their knowledge. Mattei returned to the jungle set late at night along with Brown, a couple of daring stuntmen, and a camera crew cobbled together from whoever was willing to shoot off the books. Explosives left over from earlier scenes had been unofficially borrowed, while bamboo huts earmarked for disposal were rigged with improvised fire gags. The crew used minimal lighting, mostly torches and stray floodlights, which created exaggerated shadows that lent the scene a feverish intensity. The unapproved finale unfolded like a controlled disaster. Brown sprinted through a gauntlet of detonations so strong they shook the camera operator off balance. One hut exploded earlier than expected, sending debris flying inches from Brown's path. Instead of cutting, Mattei shouted for everyone to keep going, convinced the danger only improved the footage. At one point, the camera lens fogged from the heat of a nearby blast, but Mattei embraced the smear. It made the moment look even more unhinged. By the time the sequence reached the editor, there was no hiding what Mattei had done. The studio protested, but removing the footage would have gutted the climax entirely. Pressed against deadlines and surprisingly impressed by the raw impact of the shots, they relented. To this day, that chaotic blaze of explosions filmed in open defiance of studio orders is one of the moments fans remember most about Strike Commando. Fact 8. Silent Rage. 1982. Silent Rage walked a strange line between slasher horror and martial arts thriller, but the studio wanted its ending to lean toward clean, triumphant heroism. Chuck Norris defeats the monster, order is restored, fade out. For stunt coordinator Ronnie Rondell, that approach stripped away the primal tension that defined the film. He envisioned a finale that looked raw, desperate, and silent in the way real violence can be. When the producers rejected the idea, he quietly created an opportunity of his own. Rondell organized a clandestine shoot at a section of an old quarry that production had already abandoned. The ground was jagged, unstable, exactly the kind of location the studio forbade for major stunt work. With Norris on board, a tiny crew returned at sunset with only a Panavision camera and a handful of battery-powered light. Shadows stretched across the rock formations, creating a naturally eerie look they couldn't have achieved on a controlled set. The guerrilla finale featured Norris grappling with the near-invincible killer on uneven terrain, where every misstep carried real risk. Without a full safety team, Norris performed his own falls, rolling across sharp stone and sliding down loose gravel. The stunt double for the creature executed a hazardous dive into shallow water illuminated only by a flickering construction lamp. Smoke pots were placed behind rocks to add atmosphere, and at one point wind gusts blew the haze into the crew's faces, forcing them to shoot half-blind. When the footage appeared in early assembly cuts, studio executives were livid. They threatened to reshoot the entire ending. But test audiences reacted more strongly to the secret footage. The fight felt alive, unpredictable, and genuinely dangerous. The approved ending suddenly looked flat by comparison. Backed into a corner, the studio surrendered. The finale that ended up in theaters, moody, physical, and unnervingly real, is the one Rondell engineered in secrecy. Fact 9. Raw Force. 1982. Raw Force was never a high-budget production, but even within its limited resources, the producers demanded an ending that stayed cheap and simple. They imagined a quick wrap-up with minimal stunts and no additional effects. Director Edward Murphy, however, believed the film's insanity deserved a climax that matched its chaotic tone, so he set out to shoot a finale none of the producers had approved. With the executives out of the country and the main crew dismissed for the weekend, Murphy returned to an old Manila backlot with a ragtag group of stunt performers and extras. Many props had already been thrown away, so they scavenged whatever they could find. Tattered monk robes, broken weapons, leftover skeleton masks, and barrels of unused smoke compound. The atmosphere was improvised from rubble mud, bamboo poles, shattered lanterns, transforming the set into a gritty battleground. Murphy choreographed an outrageous melee involving zombie monks, martial arts brawls, and makeshift fire gags. Stuntmen leapt from unstable scaffolding, barely clearing piles of debris. One near accident occurred when a pyrotechnic charge created using leftover gunpowder ignited too close to an actor's robe, forcing the team to extinguish it while the camera was still rolling. Murphy kept everything, convinced the danger added authenticity. When the footage arrived at the editing room, the producers were stunned. This was not the tidy finale they had signed off on. But the film simply didn't work without the rogue sequence. The approved ending lacked any sense of payoff, and early test viewers responded strongly to the madness of Murphy's unauthorized fight. Realizing they had no alternative, the studio kept it. Today, the wild, unpredictable climax of Raw Force stands as a testament to rule-breaking filmmaking and to one director's refusal to let his movie end quietly. Fact 10. Invasion USA. 1985. The production of Invasion USA had already run through mountains of explosives and urban destruction setups, so when the studio declared the ending complete, they meant it. They wanted no more blown-out windows, no more collapsing houses, no more nighttime chaos. But director Joseph Zito felt the climax needed one final savage hit, a moment that cemented the lawless brutality of the world the film built. When his request was rejected, He devised a workaround that didn't involve the studio at all. After official wrap, Zito contacted Chuck Norris and a slim crew of stunt specialists. They returned to a partially demolished suburban set, one that was scheduled to be torn down within days. It was the perfect playground for an unapproved shoot. With no full lighting setup, the team relied on street lamps, handheld lights, and what little was left from earlier action scenes. The environment looked abandoned, eerie, and war-torn, precisely what Zito wanted. The secret ending they shot revolved around an ambush built from scraps, broken doors rigged with squibs, smashed windows ready to burst outward, and walls reinforced just enough to survive one more explosion. Norris performed tight gunplay sequences that the studio's safety department would never have allowed, including a moment where shattered glass rains around him as he charges forward. The final kill shot was done using a crude, manually triggered squib system buried behind a cracked concrete pillar. When Zito delivered the first assembly cut, the studio noticed immediately these weren't the shots they had approved. Arguments erupted, with producers insisting the unauthorized footage be removed. Time, however, wasn't on their side. The release schedule was locked, and reshoots were impossible. Test audiences responded positively to the intensity of the forbidden sequence, leaving the studio no real choice. The finale that viewers remember today, the explosive, close-range confrontation, is the product of a shoot that officially never happened. Fact 11. American Ninja 2. The confrontation. 1987. Canon Films expected American Ninja 2 to end with a quick, punchy finish, a crowd-pleasing victory scene that wouldn't risk extra stunt work or unplanned costs. But director Sam Furstenberg felt the finale needed a sharper edge, something that reminded audiences of the lurking danger behind the franchise's flashy martial arts. His idea for a darker, more perilous ending was dismissed immediately, so he went ahead anyway. Furstenberg gathered Michael Dudikoff, Steve James, and a handful of stunt performers on a night when the studio believed all filming had stopped. They returned to a warehouse set partially reclaimed for another production, cracked concrete, rusted catwalks, and scattered debris. He bribed the security guards to look the other way, then lit the environment with scraps, a few work lamps, sparks from metal grinds, and practical lighting built from broken fixtures found on site. What followed was a gritty, improvised showdown. Dudikoff clashed with masked fighters atop unstable platforms, while James performed a risky high fall that left the crew breathless. The fight choreography was assembled on the spot, blending martial arts with rough, almost desperate movements. Because the effects team was gone, explosions were simulated using small flash pots salvaged from an unrelated project. Once the footage reached the editing bay, Furstenberg hid the clips inside reels labeled "Insert," ensuring executives wouldn't spot them immediately. But during early screenings, the studio realized the ending was far longer and far more intense than their approved version. They demanded a replacement. Furstenberg refused. And when internal testers praised the raw energy of the rogue finale, Canon executives reluctantly surrendered. The ending that audiences saw dark, frantic, and brutally efficient was never approved, never authorized, and never admitted by the studio. Fact 12. Blind Fury. 1989. The studio's preferred ending for Blind Fury was gentle, almost sentimental. Rutger Hauer's blind swordsman triumphs, regains his footing, and strolls into a brighter future. Director Philip Noyce disagreed. He believed the character's journey needed to end on a more uncertain, wounded note, something that acknowledged the cost of survival. When the producers rejected his pitch, he quietly assembled a splinter crew to create the ending he envisioned. Just before dawn, Noyce brought Hauer and a few essential crew members to a bridge previously used during filming. There was no lighting team, no full support unit, only car headlights, battery lamps, and reflective surfaces strategically placed to mimic cinematic highlights. With no rain machines available, they manually sprayed mist into the air to create a damp, atmospheric sheen across the scene. The unsanctioned finale portrayed Hauer's character barely standing after the final confrontation. He staggered across the bridge, gripping the railing for balance, his face marked by exhaustion and pain. A stunt performer lunged at him in one last desperate attack, an unapproved moment that pushed the emotional tone in a darker direction. The confrontation was messy, intimate, and haunting, far removed from the upbeat resolution demanded by the studio. In the editing room, Noyce blended the unauthorized footage with the approved material, creating a seamless tonal shift that wasn't immediately obvious. But when the producers reviewed the cut, they recognized the darker ending instantly. They pushed back hard, insisting it be removed. The problem was simple. Test viewers preferred the secret version. Faced with overwhelming feedback and insufficient time to reshoot, the studio reluctantly allowed Noyce's forbidden ending to remain. The result is a finale that feels both triumphant and painfully uncertain, a hidden piece of filmmaking rebellion that slipped through the cracks. Fact 13, Red Scorpion 1988. The shoot for Red Scorpion was chaotic long before the ending became an issue. The studio wanted a tidy, heroic wrap-up that placed Dolph Lundgren's character firmly on the moral high ground. But director Joseph Zito felt the film demanded something far harsher, something that reflected the brutality of the desert setting and the fractured loyalties within the story. When his darker ending was rejected, he quietly prepared a plan of his own. Late one night, Zito gathered Lundgren and a small group of stunt performers and drove deep into a section of the Namibian desert that production had already abandoned. They brought almost nothing with them, just a single camera package, a few handheld torches, and whatever pyrotechnics the stunt team could salvage. With no lighting crew, they used burning fuel-soaked cloths tied to metal rods to create flickering flames that danced across the sand. The guerrilla finale was primal and violent. Lundgren fought a brutal close-quarters battle surrounded by burning debris from a partially destroyed Soviet-style vehicle. The wind whipped the flames unpredictably, and several takes had to be abandoned when sand blasted into the camera lens. One stunt performer came dangerously close to real injury when a fire gag burned hotter than expected, but Zito insisted on continuing the rawness, he believed, was the point. When Zito integrated the footage into the early cut, the studio immediately noticed the difference. This was not the triumphant ending they had approved. They argued fiercely, demanding the rogue sequence be removed. But internal screenings told a different story. Zito's forbidden finale landed with far more impact. Viewers responded to the grit, the violence, the sense of scorched earth closure. Pressed against deadlines, the studio conceded. The fiery, brutal ending that fans remember today was born from an unauthorized shoot carried out in the middle of the desert. Fact 14, Cobra Mission. 1970. The producers of Cobra Mission envisioned a simple, restrained ending, cheap, fast, and safe. The movie had already stretched its limited budget, and they wanted the finale wrapped with minimal complications. Director Fabrizio De Angelis, however, believed the emotional spine of the story required something much more explosive. These were broken men haunted by war. The ending had to reflect that desperation. When the studio refused to fund his expanded finale, he chose to create it anyway. On a quiet Sunday, with the production office closed, De Angelis returned to a riverside set that had already been partially dismantled. He brought a small stunt unit, a few key actors, and a borrowed camera package from another Italian film shooting nearby. Smoke grenades were purchased from a military surplus vendor, while leftover props, rusted rifles, tattered uniforms, makeshift explosives were scavenged from storage. The unauthorized finale they filmed felt like a desperate last stand. The veterans launched an attack on an enemy encampment built from scrap wood and debris. Smoke poured across the riverbank as stuntmen executed risky falls into mud and shallow water. One fire stunt was performed with only minimal protection because the proper gel suit had already been returned. Several shots were captured handheld to hide the lack of production lighting, giving the sequence a gritty, documentary-like texture. When De Angelis delivered the rough cut, the producers were shocked. This was nothing like the ending they had approved. They demanded the sequence be cut immediately. But distributors who previewed the film argued that the raw, chaotic finale elevated the entire narrative. Removing it would make the film feel hollow. Outnumbered and running out of time, the studio gave in. The unapproved sequence became the emotional heartbeat of the film's conclusion, tragic, violent, and unforgettable. Fact 15. Bulletproof. 1988. Canon Films exerted unusually tight control over Bulletproof. They wanted a flashy, upbeat ending in which Gary Busey triumphed cleanly, allowing the movie to close on a commercial high note. Director Steve Carver disagreed. He felt the story needed a dirtier, harsher finale, something that exposed the vulnerability behind Busey's bravado. When his pitch was rejected, He returned to a location the studio had already written off: a junkyard. Carver gathered Busey and a few stunt performers for a clandestine nighttime shoot. The junkyard was pitch black, except for small fires burning inside crushed cars and a handful of flashlights taped to rusted metal beams. The camera was mounted to a homemade stabilizer built from scavenged steel pipes. The environment was dangerous: sharp metal edges, unstable piles of scrap, and unpredictable footing, but Carver insisted it gave the film a realism the studio-approved ending lacked. The rogue ending they shot involved a brutal ambush. Busey crawled through jagged metal, bleeding visibly, dragging himself toward his final opponent. Sparks flew from grinding metal tools used to simulate ricochets. A stunt performer executed a risky slide down a heap of scrap that collapsed under his weight, nearly injuring him. Instead of stopping, Carver kept filming, convinced the chaos added authenticity. When the footage appeared in the edit, the studio exploded in anger. They accused Carver of violating safety regulations and shooting without authorization. But when early internal screenings revealed that audiences connected far more strongly with the guerrilla finale than the polished studio version, the decision was effectively made. The ending that made it to theaters, the raw, metallic struggle set in a maze of wreckage, was the one the studio tried hardest to prevent. Bonus fact: the lost ending that survived by accident. Among all the whispered stories of unauthorized finales, none is as elusive or as unsettling as the final scene of an obscure action relic collectors refer to simply as Project Viper. Official records insist the movie ended with a routine shootout followed by a triumphant fade out. But buried beneath that studio-approved version lies a lost, forbidden climax that almost no one has seen and even fewer will admit existed. According to anonymous crew members, the director and stunt team filmed an entirely different ending during a covert late-night session in an abandoned warehouse district. They used scavenged lighting rigs, scrap metal set pieces, and improvised pyrotechnics. The sequence was bleak and violent. The hero fails to save the hostages, the villain betrays everyone, and the final explosion engulfs both men in a hellish firestorm. It was an ending dripping with nihilism, nothing like what the producers demanded. The studio rejected it instantly and ordered the footage destroyed. But the film's editor, convinced the alternate ending was too powerful to erase, hid a single surviving print by labeling it as a temp reel. That reel was screened only once at a small distributor's office in Southeast Asia. Shocked executives banned it immediately and demanded every trace be removed from circulation. Rumor has it the editor kept the print anyway. For decades, collectors have whispered about a lone VHS dub sourced from that solitary screening, grainy, unstable but unmistakably real. No one knows where the original print has gone or if it still survives. Some believe it was tucked away in a private collection. Others think it was discarded in a warehouse fire years later. Today, the forbidden ending of Project Viper remains one of action cinema's most intriguing ghosts. A final scene shot illegally, rejected violently, and preserved only because one person refused to let it disappear. If you followed these 15 hidden stories all the way to the end, you've just stepped into a side of action cinema that was never meant to be public final scenes filmed in secrecy, under pressure, or against every rule in the book. If you want more revelations like these, more buried footage, more forbidden finales, more behind-the-scenes rebellion, make sure to subscribe. Tell us which secret ending surprised you the most. And stay tuned, because the deeper we dig into the shadows of action filmmaking, the more unbelievable the truths become.